The endless white stretched before them like a frozen ocean, broken only by the rhythmic panting of their led dog and the whisper of sled runners cutting through packed snow. Aput and Nayeli had traveled this route countless times. Following caribou migrations, their fathers had tracked before them. But today, something felt different. Their dog suddenly stopped, hackles rising as he stared at an unremarkable snow mound. No amount of coaxing could move him forward. Instead, he began digging frantically, his claws scraping against something solid beneath the surface. What they uncovered defied explanation, a perfectly preserved entrance carved from ancient ice, descending into blue-black darkness that seemed to swallow their torchlight. The tunnel stretched deeper than their lights could penetrate, lined with symbols neither hunter recognized. Frozen artifacts lay scattered in alcoves like offerings to forgotten gods. But what had happened to the people who built this place? And why did their dog seem so desperate to lead them here? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Aput knelt beside the carved entrance, running his weathered fingers along symbols that seemed to pulse with an inner light beneath the ice. The markings were unlike anything he had seen in the petroglyphs near their village, or in the stories passed down by the elders. These were older, deeper, carrying a weight that made his chest tighten with unspoken dread. "Nayeli," he called softly to his hunting partner. "Look at this." The younger man approached cautiously, his sealskin boots crunching on the packed snow. At 28, Nayeli possessed the keen eyesight and steady nerves that made him invaluable during long hunts. But now his usual confidence wavered as he studied the mysterious entrance. "The ice," Nayeli whispered. "It's not natural." "Someone carved this," Aput nodded grimly. In his 53 years on this land, he had never encountered craftsmanship like this. The entrance descended at a precise angle, its walls smooth as glass, despite what must have been centuries of existence. Frost patterns spiraled along the carved surfaces in geometric designs that hurt to look at directly. Their dog, Nuka, had retreated to the sled and now lay with his head between his paws, whimpering softly. The animal's distress troubled Aput more than the strange tunnel itself. Nuka had guided them through blizzards that would have killed lesser teams, had sensed thin ice from distances that saved their lives more than once. If something frightened their most reliable companion, wisdom demanded caution, yet curiosity proved stronger than wisdom. Aput retrieved his seal oil lamp from the sled, its flame casting dancing shadows as they approached the entrance. The light revealed the tunnel's true extent. It plunged deeper into the earth than their combined reach could illuminate, disappearing into blue-black depths that seemed to absorb their torchlight. "We should return to the village," Nayeli suggested, though his eyes remained fixed on the mysterious passage. "Bring the elders, the shaman. This is beyond our understanding." "The storm season approaches," Aput replied, studying the darkening sky. "By the time we return with others, this could be buried under 20 feet of fresh snow. We may never find it again." As if summoned by his words, wind began to whistle across the ice, carrying the metallic scent of approaching weather. They had perhaps 2 hours before the gathering storm would force them to seek shelter or risk being caught in the open during what promised to be a fierce Arctic gale. Aput made his decision. "We go down, just far enough to see what this is." They prepared carefully, as their fathers had taught them. Extra oil for the lamp, their hunting knives within easy reach, and rope tied around each man's waist with enough slack to move freely, but not enough to become separated in the darkness. Nayeli marked their entry point with a sealskin flag tied to his spear, then planted the weapon firmly in the snow beside the entrance. The first steps into the tunnel felt like descending into the belly of some great beast. The temperature dropped immediately, but not in the gradual way of natural caves. Here, the cold struck them like a physical blow, carrying an otherworldly quality that seemed to seep through their thick clothing and settle in their bones. 10 steps down, Aput's lamp illuminated something that made both men freeze. Embedded in the left wall, at precisely eye level, sat an object that defied explanation, a compass unlike any they had seen, carved from what appeared to be whalebone and inlaid with materials that gleamed like captured starlight. The compass needle, instead of pointing north as any sensible navigation tool should, pointed steadily deeper into the tunnel system. As Aput moved the lamp, the needle remained fixed on its mysterious bearing, as if drawn by some force far beneath the earth. "This was left for someone to find," Nayeli observed, his voice barely above a whisper. "A guide." Aput studied the bone compass more closely. The craftsmanship exceeded anything their people could create. Yet the materials were familiar: whalebone, walrus ivory, and what might have been meteoric iron. Someone with their knowledge of Arctic resources had created this tool, but with skills that suggested generations of accumulated wisdom. "We follow where it leads," Aput decided. "But carefully." And we turned back at the first sign of danger. The tunnel descended in a gradual spiral, its walls lined with more of the strange symbols that seemed to shift and dance in their lamplight. The bone compass remained their constant guide, its needle never wavering from its downward bearing. Each step took them further from the familiar world above and deeper into mysteries that predated their oldest stories. Behind them, wind howled across the entrance as the storm arrived ahead of schedule, sealing their passage to the surface with a wall of driving snow. The spiral tunnel opened without warning into a vast circular chamber that swallowed their lamplight at its edges. Aput raised the flame higher, trying to gauge the space's true dimensions, but the darkness seemed to drink the light before it could reveal the far walls. The bone compass in his other hand pointed steadily across the chamber toward what appeared to be a raised platform in the center. Their footsteps echoed strangely in the space, creating whispers that seemed to come from every direction at once. The floor beneath them was polished smooth, covered in intricate patterns that reminded Aput of the ice formations that appeared on lakes during the coldest nights. But these were clearly carved by human hands with deliberate purpose. As they moved toward the center, their light began to reveal the chamber's true treasures. Along the walls, carved ice shelves held objects that made no sense in the context of their people's history. Tools crafted from materials they couldn't identify, carved figurines depicting animals that seemed familiar, yet somehow wrong, and containers that might once have held food or sacred oils, but now sat empty as abandoned hopes. "Aput," Nayeli whispered, pointing toward one of the shelves. "Look at this!" The object that had caught his attention defied easy description. It appeared to be some kind of cooking pot, but forged from metal that gleamed like silver, yet felt warm to the touch despite the frigid air. Strange symbols covered its surface, and when Nayeli breathed near it, the markings seemed to glow faintly, as if responding to the warmth of life itself. But these wonders paled beside what waited on the central platform. A pedestal carved from a single piece of jade-green ice rose from the chamber's heart, and upon it rested a mask that stopped both hunters in their tracks. The face it depicted was neither fully human nor completely animal, but something that existed in the space between. One half showed human features carved with exquisite detail: high cheekbones, a proud brow, eyes that seemed to hold ancient wisdom. The other half bore the characteristics of a creature they couldn't identify: elongated skull, teeth too sharp for any earthly animal, and an eye socket that seemed to peer into dimensions beyond their understanding. The mask was crafted from jade and ivory, materials that would have required trade networks spanning vast distances. But more disturbing than its exotic construction was the way it seemed to watch them. As they moved around the pedestal, the mask's gaze appeared to follow their progress, as if some spark of awareness remained trapped within the carved features. "This is a sacred place," Aput said finally, his voice barely audible in the vast space. "We shouldn't be here." Yet even as he spoke, he found himself drawn closer to the mask. Something about its dual nature resonated with truths he had never fully articulated. His own people existed in the space between worlds, the world of ice and the world of water, the world of animals and the world of spirits, the world of the living and the world of ancestors who still spoke through wind and storm. Nayeli had discovered something else that demanded their attention. Along the chamber's walls, painted murals told a story in images so vivid they seemed to move in the flickering lamplight. The scenes depicted people who looked like their own ancestors, but wearing clothing and carrying tools that belonged to no culture either hunter recognized. The first mural showed these ancient people living in harmony with the land, hunting great beasts and building settlements that reached toward the sky. But as the story progressed around the chamber's circumference, the images grew darker. The sky in the paintings turned black. Strange shapes appeared beneath the ice, and the people began to flee in obvious terror. In the final scenes, the survivors were shown constructing something: tunnels, chambers, places of refuge carved deep into the earth. The last image depicted them sealing themselves away, leaving behind only warnings for those who might come after. They were running from something, Nayeli observed, studying a particularly detailed scene that showed families abandoning their homes in the depths of winter. Something so terrible they chose to live underground rather than face it. Aput moved back to the mask, studying its impossible features more closely. Now he could see that it wasn't simply decorative, it was functional. Leather straps attached to the sides suggested it was meant to be worn, and small holes positioned over the mouth and nostrils would allow the wearer to breathe. But what kind of ceremony would require such a mask? And what had it meant to the people who created this hidden sanctuary? The bone compass in his hand had begun to vibrate gently, its needle now pointing toward a passage on the far side of the chamber that they hadn't noticed before. Whatever had guided them this far wanted them to continue deeper into the maze of tunnels that lay beneath their feet. Above them, wind howled through the entrance they had descended, reminding them that the storm had indeed arrived, and their path back to the surface world was now blocked by forces beyond their control. The passage beyond the ceremonial chamber narrowed considerably, forcing them to move single file through corridors that felt increasingly oppressive. Their lamplight revealed tool marks in the ice walls, evidence of hasty excavation rather than the careful craftsmanship they had witnessed in the main chamber. Someone had carved these tunnels in desperation, racing against time or circumstance that brooked no delay. Scattered along the floor lay objects that spoke of interrupted lives. A child's toy carved from driftwood, its surface worn smooth by countless small hands. A woman's sewing kit with bone needles still threaded with sinew. Cooking utensils dropped in apparent haste, their contents long since frozen into unrecognizable masses. But it was what they found at the tunnel's end that truly chilled both hunters to their cores. A stone tablet stood propped against the far wall, covered in text carved so deeply into its surface that even centuries of ice formation couldn't obscure the markings. The writing appeared in multiple scripts, as if whoever created it wanted to ensure the message could be understood by any people who might discover this place. Aput approached the tablet slowly, holding his lamp close to the carved surface. The first section was written in symbols he recognized, an ancient form of inuktitut that his grandfather had taught him during long winter nights. The words were archaic, but their meaning became clear as he traced each character with his finger. "Do not wake the sleepers," he read aloud, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "The deep cold preserves them for good reason. They guard against what stirs beneath the earth." Nayeli moved closer, studying other sections of the tablet. These markings here, they look like the symbols the Sami use for their sacred sites. And this section might be from the Aleut Islands. The realization struck both men simultaneously. This wasn't a message from one isolated group, but a warning that had been shared across the entire Arctic region. Somehow, peoples separated by thousands of miles of ice and water had collaborated to create this urgent communication for future generations. Aput continued reading the Inuktitut text, though each word filled him with growing dread. When the earth trembles and the ice sings, when animals flee without cause and the aurora burns in strange colors, know that it stirs again. The sleepers must not be disturbed, for they are the last guardians of the old knowledge. Below the written warnings, crude drawings illustrated the consequences of ignoring the message. Figures emerged from beneath the ice, their forms suggesting something that had once been human, but had been transformed by forces beyond natural understanding. Other images showed communities fleeing in terror, their homes consumed by an unnatural darkness that seemed to devour everything in its path. "Look at this," Nayeli said, pointing to a section near the tablet's base. Personal items had been deliberately placed around its foundation. Hunting tools, family totems, even what appeared to be a baby's first mittens. These weren't casual offerings, but deliberate sacrifices meant to give the warning additional power. The bone compass in Aput's free hand had begun to pulse more rapidly, its needle swinging between the tablet and another passage that led even deeper into the earth. Whatever force had guided them this far seemed torn between urging them forward and warning them away. A sound from behind made both hunters spin around, their hearts racing. But it was only ice settling somewhere in the tunnels they had already traversed, the normal groaning of a structure under immense pressure. Yet the noise served as a reminder that they were far from safety, trapped in a maze of passages that might collapse without warning. "We should go back," Nayeli said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We've seen enough. The village elders need to know about this place." Aput studied the tablet one more time, trying to memorize every detail of its urgent warnings. But as he prepared to turn away, something caught his eye. Fresh scratches in the ice near the tablet's base. Someone had been here recently, perhaps within the last few years, and had left their own message. The newer markings were crude, carved with a metal tool rather than the stone implements that had created the original warnings. The script was modern Inuktitut, and the message was brief but terrifying. "They are stirring. The signs have begun. May the ancestors forgive us for what we must do." Below this recent addition, someone had sketched a rough map showing the tunnel system's layout. According to the drawing, they were still only in the outermost chambers of what appeared to be a vast underground complex. The deepest sections were marked with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The bone compass pulsed again, more insistently now, and both hunters noticed that the temperature in the passage had begun to drop even further. Their breath, which had been visible since entering the tunnels, now froze into tiny crystals that tinkled to the ground like broken glass. Something was changing in the deep places beneath their feet, responding to their presence or awakening according to its own ancient schedule. The passage opened into a hall so vast that their lamplight failed to reach its ceiling or far walls. But what they could see defied every expectation and challenged their understanding of the possible. Along both sides of the enormous chamber, ice alcoves had been carved into the walls at perfect intervals, each one containing a human figure preserved in crystalline suspension. The figures weren't dead in any conventional sense. Their skin retained the healthy color of the living. Their chests rose and fell in barely perceptible breaths, and their eyes moved beneath closed lids as if they dreamed of distant worlds. They wore clothing that belonged to no culture either hunter could identify, garments woven from materials that seemed to shift color in the lamplight, adorned with symbols that matched those on the warning tablet. Aput moved closer to the nearest alcove, his breath catching as he studied the figure within. The man appeared to be middle-aged, with the weathered features of someone who had spent decades facing Arctic storms. But his hands bore scars that told of battles against something other than wind and cold, and around his neck hung ornaments carved from materials that shouldn't exist in the natural world. "How many?" Nayeli whispered, trying to count the alcoves that disappeared into the chamber's depths. "Dozens," Aput replied, though he suspected the true number was far higher. "Maybe hundreds." As they ventured deeper into the hall, the bone compass led them to a central alcove that differed from all the others. This one was larger, more ornately carved, and the figure within it wore robes that marked him as a person of great importance. His hair was white with age, but his face held the kind of wisdom that comes only from witnessing events beyond ordinary human experience. Around his neck hung an amulet unlike anything either hunter had ever seen. The pendant appeared to be carved from crystal so pure it was nearly transparent, yet within its depths light seemed to move and pulse with its own rhythm. As they watched, the crystal's inner glow grew brighter, responding to their presence in ways that natural materials shouldn't. "He's their leader," Nayeli observed, studying the central figure's elaborate clothing and the reverent positioning of the nearby alcoves. Or was, before they chose this sleep. The crystal amulet's pulsing had synchronized with something else in the chamber, a barely audible humming that seemed to emanate from the ice itself. As the sound grew stronger, subtle changes began to appear in the sleeping figures. Fingers twitched almost imperceptibly, facial expressions shifted, and the rhythm of their breathing deepened. Aput felt an overwhelming compulsion to touch the crystal amulet. The urge came not from curiosity, but from something deeper, as if the pendant was calling to him across centuries of separation. Against his better judgment, he reached out and placed his palm against the smooth crystal surface. The effect was instantaneous and overwhelming. Light erupted from the pendant, flooding the entire chamber with radiance that revealed its true scope. The hall stretched far beyond their previous estimates, containing not dozens, but hundreds of sleeping figures. More importantly, the light awakened something in each of them. Eyes began to open throughout the chamber, though they focused on nothing in the physical world. Lips moved in silent conversations with unseen companions. Hands gestured as if manipulating objects that existed in realms beyond normal perception. The sleepers were stirring, but they hadn't yet returned to the waking world. The central figure's eyes opened fully, fixing on Aput with an intensity that made the hunter step back involuntarily. The man's gaze held depths of knowledge and sorrow that spoke of terrible sacrifices made for purposes greater than individual survival. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. "Who wakes the guardians before the appointed time?" The words came in the ancient form of Inuktitut that Aput's grandfather had taught him, but underneath the familiar sounds lay harmonics that suggested meanings beyond mere language. This was someone who had learned to speak with the voice of the ice itself. "We are hunters," Aput managed to reply. "We found this place by accident." The ancient figure's expression shifted, revealing surprise and something that might have been hope. "No accident brings seekers to this threshold. The old agreements are breaking down. The barriers weaken. You carry the blood of those who made the first compact." Throughout the chamber, other sleepers were responding to their leader's awakening. Their movements became more purposeful, though their eyes remained fixed on visions that belonged to other times and places. The crystal amulet's light pulsed faster, and the humming in the ice grew strong enough to feel as vibrations in their bones. "What compact?" Nayeli asked, though his voice barely carried across the space between them. The central figure turned his ancient gaze toward the younger hunter, and his expression grew grave. "The agreement that keeps the deep dweller in its prison. The promise that sealed the passages between worlds. The sacrifice that your people have forgotten, though the time for remembering draws near." The bone compass in Aput's hand had begun to spin wildly, its needle no longer pointing in any single direction, but rotating continuously as if overwhelmed by competing forces. The ancient guardian gestured toward a side chamber with movements that seemed to flow like water despite his centuries of sleep. As they followed, Aput noticed that other sleepers throughout the hall were beginning to stir more actively, their lips moving in what sounded like preparations for some great undertaking. The side chamber contained a single pedestal upon which rested a sphere of polished obsidian, so perfect it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The ancient one approached the dark stone with reverence, his weathered hands hovering over its surface without quite touching. "This is the memory stone," he explained, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in their bones. "It holds the true history of what befell our people, and why we chose the long sleep rather than face what was coming." Without waiting for their consent, he placed both palms against the obsidian sphere. The world exploded into visions. Aput found himself standing in a village that existed in some distant past, watching people who looked remarkably like his own ancestors going about their daily lives. Children played games in the snow, while their parents prepared meals and tended to tools. Elders shared stories around fires that burned with flames of impossible colors. Everything seemed peaceful, prosperous, normal, but something was wrong with the sky. Where aurora should have danced in familiar patterns, twisted shapes writhed against the darkness like living things in pain. The lights moved with purpose, rather than following the natural rhythms of the magnetic fields, and their colors included hues that shouldn't exist in any earthly spectrum. The vision shifted, showing the same village days or perhaps weeks later. Now the people moved with urgency, packing essential items and abandoning homes their families had occupied for generations. Children cried as they were pulled away from familiar places, and elders spoke in hushed tones about signs and portents that foretold disaster. In the center of the village, a great crack had appeared in the earth itself. The fissure glowed with the same unnatural light that polluted the sky, and from its depths came sounds that made even the bravest warriors step back in fear. Things were moving down there, things that had no business existing in the world of men. The memory stone showed them other villages, other communities across the vast Arctic regions, all facing the same crisis. The earth itself was breaking open, releasing entities that belonged to times before human history began. These creatures brought with them a cold that killed not just the body, but something deeper, a darkness that devoured hope itself. Aput watched in horror as the visions revealed the scope of the catastrophe. Entire communities vanished overnight, leaving behind only empty settlements and strange formations in the ice that hurt to look at directly. The few survivors fled toward predetermined gathering points, carrying with them knowledge that had been passed down through generations for exactly this purpose. The Memory Stone's next vision showed the construction of the tunnel complex they now explored. Hundreds of people worked with desperate efficiency, carving chambers and passages according to plans that seemed impossibly complex. But these weren't random excavations. Every tunnel, every chamber, every passage served a specific purpose in some greater design. Shamans and wise ones gathered around stones similar to the one they were now touching, sharing knowledge from across the Arctic regions and combining their understanding into something larger than any single culture could achieve. They spoke of barriers that could be created, of sleeps that could preserve life through the darkest times, of guardians who would watch and wait for the proper moment to act. The most disturbing vision showed the final decision. The entities from beneath the earth had grown too strong, their influence spreading like poison through the natural world. The only way to contain them was to create a living seal, powered by the life force of volunteers who would enter the long sleep and maintain the barriers through force of will alone. Families said goodbye to loved ones who would never wake again. Warriors accepted assignments that meant abandoning everything they had ever fought to protect. Children too young to understand the full implications were prepared for sleeps that might last centuries. But the most terrible revelation came in the final vision. The barriers weren't permanent. They required periodic renewal, and the knowledge of how to perform these renewals had been deliberately scattered across multiple cultures to prevent any single disaster from destroying the information. Entirely, the Memory Stone showed them signs that would herald the barrier's weakening, unusual aurora patterns, seismic disturbances in regions that should be geologically stable, and behavioral changes in animals that possessed ancient instincts about supernatural threats. As the visions faded, Aput realized with growing horror that he had witnessed many of these signs in recent years without understanding their significance. The ancient guardian removed his hands from the memory stone, and the oppressive weight of revealed knowledge settled over them like a burial shroud. Now you understand why we sleep, and why our awakening signals that the time of trial approaches once more. The ancient guardian led them deeper into the complex, through passages that seemed to reshape themselves as they walked. The ice walls flowed and reformed, creating new pathways while sealing others behind them, as if the structure itself was alive and testing their resolve. They emerged into a perfectly circular chamber, dominated by a stone altar carved with symbols that made their eyes water to study directly. Upon the altar lay a pair of gloves unlike any they had ever seen, crafted from leather so old it should have crumbled to dust centuries ago, yet preserved in perfect condition by forces beyond their understanding. The trial gauntlets, the guardian explained, his voice carrying both reverence and warning. They measure not just courage, but the depth of connection to the old ways. Many have attempted the testing. Few have proven worthy. The gloves appeared to be made from the hide of some Arctic animal, but the leather bore patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. Bone clasps secured the wrists, carved with the same flowing symbols they had seen throughout the complex. Most unsettling were the palms, which contained inlays of what looked like meteoric iron that pulsed with faint inner light. "What kind of test?" Nayeli asked, though something in his voice suggested he already feared the answer. "The gauntlets will show you visions of your ancestors' struggles," the guardian replied. "You will experience their trials as if they were your own. You will face the same choices they faced, feel the same fears they conquered. If your spirits prove strong enough, you will gain access to the deeper knowledge. If not," he didn't finish the sentence, but the warning was clear enough. Aput approached the altar slowly, studying the ancient gloves with the careful attention he brought to reading weather patterns or tracking wounded animals. These weren't simple tools. They were instruments of judgment, created by people who understood that some knowledge could only be safely shared with those who possessed the wisdom to use it properly. "Both of us?" he asked. "The trials are individual, but the knowledge they unlock serves the community. One may succeed where the other fails. Both may prove worthy or both may fall short. The gauntlets care nothing for our hopes, only for truth." Without further hesitation, Aput picked up the gloves and slipped them onto his hands. The transformation was immediate and overwhelming. The chamber disappeared, replaced by a landscape of ice and snow that stretched to distant horizons. But this wasn't the familiar Arctic of his lifetime. This was an older world, where the aurora burned with unnatural colors and the very air crackled with supernatural tension. He stood in the boots of an ancestor whose name he had never learned, facing a choice that would echo through generations. Before him stretched two paths across the frozen wilderness. One led to safety, to a distant settlement where his family waited with food and warmth. The other descended toward a crack in the earth from which unnatural light spilled like corrupted blood. The vision's emotional weight struck him like a physical blow. This ancestor felt the same love for family that Aput carried, the same protective instincts, the same desire to ensure his children grew up in a world free from terror. But he also understood that someone had to face the source of the corruption, even if it meant never seeing those beloved faces again. Aput felt himself making the choice his ancestor had made, turning away from safety and descending toward the supernatural threat. Each step carried the weight of sacrifice, the knowledge that survival was unlikely, but duty demanded the attempt anyway. The vision shifted, showing him other ancestors facing similar choices. A grandmother who stayed behind to hold a barrier while her family escaped. A young warrior who volunteered for the long sleep so that future generations might have guardians. A shaman who gave up his own life force to power protections that would last for centuries. Each trial tested different aspects of character: courage in the face of overwhelming odds, wisdom to make impossible choices, compassion that extended beyond immediate family to encompass all living things, and the strength to sacrifice personal desires for greater needs. When Nayeli donned the second glove, his trials began simultaneously, but followed different paths. Aput could sense his companion's struggles without seeing the specific visions, feeling the younger man's determination as he faced tests designed to measure his particular strengths and weaknesses. The gauntlets grew warm against their skin, the meteoric iron inlays pulsing in rhythm with their heartbeats. Power flowed through the ancient leather, connecting them to a chain of guardians that stretched back through countless generations. When the visions finally ended, both hunters found themselves back in the circular chamber, but fundamentally changed. Knowledge that hadn't existed moments before now filled their minds. Understanding of the complex rituals needed to maintain the barriers, awareness of signs that would herald the deep dwellers' awakening, and most importantly, acceptance of the roles they were now destined to play. The guardians studied their faces with ancient eyes, reading the success of their trials in expressions that had been transformed by revelations. "You have proven worthy," he said simply. "Now the real work begins." The guardian led them through a passage that descended sharply, the air growing thick with an oppressive energy that made breathing difficult. At the end of the tunnel, they entered a chamber that felt different from all the others, older, more primal, as if it had been carved not by human hands, but by the earth itself in response to some cosmic trauma. Here, preserved under layers of ice so clear it was nearly invisible, lay a scroll that defied their understanding of materials and preservation. The hide appeared to be from no animal they could identify, covered in text that seemed to move and shift even as they watched. The writing was illuminated with pigments that glowed with their own inner light, creating words that burned themselves into their vision. "The prophecy scroll," the guardian said, his voice heavy with centuries of dread. "Written by the first shamans who encountered the deep dweller, when it was merely stirring rather than fully awakened." Aput approached the preserved scroll carefully, though every instinct screamed at him to flee from this chamber and everything it contained. The text was written in multiple languages, each section revealing different aspects of the same terrible truth. He could read portions in ancient Inuktitut, while other sections were in scripts he didn't recognize, but somehow understood through the knowledge the gauntlets had imparted. The prophecy began with a description of the world before the coming of men, when ancient entities ruled the spaces between ice and stone. These beings existed in dimensions that touched their reality at specific points, usually far beneath the earth or in the deepest ocean trenches. They were neither alive nor dead in any sense humans could comprehend, but something that transcended such simple categories. According to the scroll, one of these entities had been trapped by geological forces during the formation of the Arctic regions. The ice that covered their lands wasn't just frozen water, it was a living prison that held something that should never have been allowed to touch the human world. The entity's dreams leaked through the barriers, influencing the natural world in subtle ways that gradually prepared conditions for its eventual escape. The prophecy described cycles of awakening that occurred roughly every 1,000 years. During these periods, the entity's influence grew stronger, causing the unnatural phenomena that Aput and Nayeli had witnessed in recent years. Aurora displays that followed impossible patterns, seismic activity in regions that should have been geologically stable, animal behaviors that suggested they were fleeing from something their ancient instincts recognized as utterly wrong. But the current cycle was different. The scroll described how human activity, mining, drilling, the construction of permanent settlements in previously untouched regions, had begun to weaken the natural barriers that held the entity in check. Each disturbance created tiny cracks in the prison, allowing more of its influence to seep into their reality. Nayeli read aloud from a section written in symbols that resembled Sami script. "When the ice sings with voices not of wind, when the earth trembles without cause, when the lights in the sky burn in colors that have no names. Know that the deep dweller stirs in its ancient prison. The description matched too closely the phenomena they had both witnessed over the past several seasons. Hunters had reported strange sounds coming from beneath the ice, low-frequency vibrations that seemed to carry meanings just beyond comprehension. Elders spoke of dreams filled with visions of dark waters and impossible geometries. Even their dogs had begun acting strangely, refusing to travel certain routes they had used for generations. The most terrifying section of the prophecy dealt with what would happen if the entity achieved full awakening. The text described a transformation of the Arctic regions that would render them uninhabitable by any form of life that humans would recognize. The cold would become something that killed not just the body, but the spirit itself. The ice would become a conduit for the entity's will, turning the familiar landscape into an extension of its alien consciousness. But the prophecy also contained hope. It spoke of guardians who would maintain watch through the darkest times, preserving knowledge and power needed to reinforce the barriers when the signs appeared. These guardians would sacrifice their normal lives, entering the long sleep that preserved both their bodies and their accumulated wisdom for the moment when they would be needed most. The scroll's final section revealed the most crucial information. The entity's prison could be strengthened, but only through rituals that required specific knowledge and materials. The process demanded cooperation between all the Arctic peoples, sharing resources and wisdom that had been deliberately scattered to prevent any single catastrophe from destroying the information entirely. The Guardian's voice carried the weight of inevitable doom as he explained the current situation. The barriers weaken with each passing season. The deep dweller's influence spreads through dreams and visions, preparing the way for its physical manifestation. Modern disturbances have accelerated the process beyond what our ancestors anticipated. As if responding to their conversation, a low vibration began to resonate through the chamber floor, a sound so deep it was felt rather than heard. The prophecy scroll's illuminated text pulsed brighter, and somewhere in the darkness beyond their lamp's reach, something large shifted its position in the depths far below. The Guardian led them back through passages that seemed to reconfigure themselves with each journey, finally stopping before a chamber they hadn't seen before. Inside, a raised dais held an object that immediately commanded their attention. A staff carved from what appeared to be a single piece of narwhal tusk, but one that had grown far larger than any natural whale could produce. The awakening staff stood nearly as tall as a man, its surface covered in intricate carvings that spiraled from base to tip in patterns that seemed to move when viewed peripherally. At its crown, 7 crystals of different colors were embedded in a formation that reminded Aput of the constellation his grandfather had called the Hunter's Belt, though these stones pulsed with inner light that no earthly gem should possess. This is the key to awakening. The remaining guardians, the Ancient One explained, his reverence for the artifact evident in every word. But the ritual requires more than simply touching crystal to flesh. The awakening must be performed according to precise protocols, using elements that connect our reality to the deeper forces that bind the universe together. The Guardian approached a series of ice tablets mounted on the chamber walls, each one containing detailed instructions carved in the flowing script they had seen throughout the complex. As he read, his expression grew increasingly grave, and Aput began to understand why so many Guardians had chosen to remain in the long sleep rather than face what awakening would demand. 4 elements must be gathered, the Guardian continued, tracing the carved instructions with one weathered finger. Each represents a fundamental force that the deep dweller cannot corrupt or control. Fire that burns without consuming, water that flows upward against gravity, wind that carries voices of the dead, earth that remembers the first words spoken by living beings. Nayeli studied the carvings more closely, trying to understand how such impossible elements could be obtained. Where do we find these things? They sound like riddles rather than practical instructions. They are both, the Guardian replied. Each element exists in specific places where the natural world touches something deeper. But obtaining them requires more than simply traveling to the correct locations. The seeker must understand the true nature of what they seek. The first element, sacred fire, could only be obtained from flames that had burned continuously for generations, tended by shamans who understood fire's connection to the life force itself. Such flames existed in only a few locations across the Arctic regions, carefully guarded by communities that had maintained the old traditions despite pressures to abandon ancient ways. The sacred water presented an even greater challenge. It had to be drawn from springs that flowed upward through permafrost, defying natural laws through forces that geologists couldn't explain. These springs were considered sacred by all Arctic peoples, places where the spirits of ancestors were said to communicate with the living through the impossible movement of water. Against gravity, wind that carried voices of the dead could be captured during specific weather conditions, when atmospheric pressures created sounds that resembled human speech. Experienced shamans could distinguish between natural wind patterns and the supernatural phenomena that occurred when the barrier between worlds grew thin. The final element, earth that remembered, came from burial grounds where the first humans to settle in the Arctic regions had been laid to rest. The soil in these places retained some essence of those ancient people, preserving not just their physical remains, but somehow maintaining connection to their thoughts and experiences. The timing is crucial. The Guardian continued, studying additional tablets that detailed the astronomical requirements for the ritual. The awakening can only be performed when specific celestial bodies align in configurations that occur rarely. The next suitable alignment begins in 3 days and lasts for less than 12 hours. The impossibility of their task began to sink in. Even if they could locate and obtain all 4 sacred elements, doing so within 3 days would require traveling across vast distances in conditions that would challenge even experienced Arctic travelers. And that assumed they could convince the Guardians of these sacred sites to share resources that had been protected for centuries. The awakening staff pulsed with brighter light as if responding to their growing understanding of the challenges ahead. The 7 crystals at its tip began to resonate with harmonics that seemed to bypass their ears and speak directly to their souls. The sound carried meanings that transcended language, urgency, hope, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility that made their earlier concerns about hunting and survival seem trivial by comparison. "There is another way," the Guardian said finally, his voice heavy with implications they hadn't yet grasped. "The elements can be obtained more quickly, but the cost is higher than you may be willing to pay." He led them to the final set of tablets, where alternative instructions were carved in script so ancient it predated any written language they recognized. The symbols seemed to writhe with life, and reading them required the enhanced understanding that the trial gauntlets had provided. The alternative method involved creating the sacred elements through personal sacrifice, rather than gathering them from existing sources. Fire could be drawn from one's own life force. Water could be extracted from blood spilled willingly. Wind could be created by releasing one's final breath. Earth could be formed from flesh given freely to nourish the awakening ritual. Neither. Hunter spoke for a long moment as the implications became clear. The journey back to the surface world felt like emerging from a dream into harsh reality. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed by fresh snow that sparkled under stars brighter than either hunter remembered seeing. Their dog Nooka greeted them with obvious relief, though he remained nervous around the entrance to the tunnel complex, as if he could sense the otherworldly energies that still clung to their clothing. They had chosen the difficult path rather than the sacrificial one, though both understood that time worked against them. 3 days to gather elements from sacred sites scattered across distances that would normally require weeks to traverse. But the Guardian had given them something that made the impossible merely improbable, a bowl carved from meteoric iron that had fallen, from the sky during their ancestors' first encounters. With the deep dweller, the sacred fire bowl was unlike any artifact they had carried from the tunnels. While the other objects radiated ancient power, this one seemed to absorb energy from its surroundings, growing warmer as they traveled and pulsing with rhythms that matched their heartbeats. According to the Guardian's instructions, the bowl could contain flames that would normally consume any earthly vessel, preserving sacred fire for the duration of their journey. Their first destination lay 2 days' hard travel to the north, where the community of Sivulik maintained flames that had burned continuously for over 300 years. The village sat on a small island, accessible only during specific tidal conditions, protected by traditions that discouraged casual visitors and customs that tested the worthiness of those who sought their sacred fire. The journey tested both their endurance and their sled dog's limits. Nuka led the team with determination that surprised them, as if he understood the urgency of their mission, despite having no knowledge of what they had discovered. The other dogs followed his lead, maintaining pace across terrain that should have exhausted them within hours. As they traveled, signs of the deep dweller's growing influence became increasingly obvious. The aurora that should have been absent during this phase of the seasonal cycle instead burned across the sky in patterns that hurt to watch directly. Animals that should have been preparing for winter migrations instead huddled in groups, refusing to venture into areas they had used for countless generations. Most disturbing were the sounds that came from beneath the ice, low-frequency vibrations that seemed to carry meaning just beyond comprehension, as if something vast was trying to communicate through the barriers that contained it. Their dogs whimpered when these sounds occurred, and even Nuka's usual confidence wavered when the vibrations grew particularly strong. They reached Sivulik as the second day's light began to fade, finding a community that had clearly been expecting their arrival. The village's shaman, an elderly woman whose eyes held depths that reminded them of the ancient guardian, greeted them before they had fully stopped their sled. "You carry the scent of deep places," she said without preamble, "and the burden of knowledge that should have remained buried." The sacred fire burned in a carefully tended structure at the village's heart, flames that had never been allowed to die even during the community's darkest hours. The shaman explained that maintaining the fire required constant vigilance and sacrifices that most outsiders couldn't understand. Wood was scarce in their region, so the flames consumed offerings of seal oil, carved bone, and sometimes personal possessions that held special meaning to the givers. "To take fire from this place," the shaman warned, "you must offer something of equal value in return. The flames will judge whether your offering possesses the spiritual weight to justify their use." Aput approached the sacred flames with the meteoric bowl, understanding that this moment would test more than just the artifact's ability to contain supernatural fire. He placed his grandfather's hunting amulet into the flames, a carved walrus tusk that had been passed down through 5 generations and had never failed to bring good fortune during the most dangerous hunts. The fire consumed the amulet instantly, but instead of destroying it, the flames seemed to absorb its essence and transform it into something more refined. When Aput held the bowl above the fire, sacred flames flowed upward like liquid light, filling the meteoric iron vessel with fire that burned without heat and gave off light that illuminated more than just the physical world. The second element proved more challenging to obtain. The sacred spring lay another day's journey into territory that had become increasingly unstable as the deep dwellers' influence spread. Cracks had appeared in ice that should have been solid for months, and the aurora overhead had begun to pulse in rhythms that synchronized with the vibrations from below. When they finally reached the spring, they found water flowing upward through permafrost in defiance of every natural law, creating a fountain that reached toward the sky as if seeking to escape the Earth's gravity. The water was crystal clear, but felt alive in ways that ordinary water never could, carrying within it the voices of ancestors who had drunk from this same source across countless generations. Using containers blessed by the Sivulic shaman, they collected sacred water that remained liquid, despite temperatures that should have frozen it instantly. The water sang as they gathered it, harmonies that spoke of memories older than human civilization and promises that transcended individual mortality. They returned to the tunnel complex as the third day's light began to fade, carrying their precious elements in containers that seemed to bend reality around them. The sacred fire bowl cast no shadows despite its brilliant flame. The blessed water remained perfectly still despite the motion of travel, and the captured wind sang softly of voices that belonged to no living throats. The earth from the ancient burial ground felt warm against their hands, as if it remembered the touch of people who had been dead for centuries. The awakening chamber had transformed during their absence. The other guardians from the Hall of Sleepers had gathered here, moving with the careful deliberation of those who were still adjusting to consciousness after centuries of dreaming. Their eyes held the distant look of people who had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations during their supernatural slumber. At the chamber's center, 7 crystal bells hung from supports carved from the same meteoric iron as the fire bowl. Each bell was precisely tuned to frequencies that resonated with the life force itself, and together they formed an instrument capable of reaching into the spaces between worlds where the deep dwellers' influence was strongest. The ancient guardian who had first awakened studied their gathered elements with approval, tempered by grave concern. "You have done well, but the true challenge begins now. The harmony bells must be rung in precise sequence, creating frequencies that will strengthen the barriers without alerting the deep dweller to what we attempt." He led them through the ritual's requirements with the patience of someone who understood that failure meant consequences beyond their comprehension. Each bell corresponded to a different aspect of the life force: birth, growth, maturity, wisdom, sacrifice, transformation, and renewal. The sequence in which they were rung would determine whether the barriers were strengthened or whether their efforts would instead weaken the prison that contained their ancient enemy. Aput took his position beside the first bell, its crystal surface reflecting the sacred fire's light in patterns that seemed to contain entire galaxies. The bell was larger than his head and carved from a single piece of crystal so pure it was nearly transparent. Yet when he touched it lightly, it produced sounds that seemed to come from the earth's core itself. Nayeli stood ready at the fourth bell, the one that corresponded to wisdom gained through suffering. His role would be crucial during the sequence's middle phase, when the barriers between dimensions would be at their thinnest and the risk of attracting unwanted attention at its highest. The other guardians took their positions around the remaining bells, each one carrying knowledge accumulated through centuries of preparation for this moment. Their faces showed the strain of maintaining consciousness after so long in the suspended state. But their determination remained unshakable. "Remember," the ancient guardian warned, "the bells must be struck at intervals that match the heartbeat of the earth itself. Too fast, and we risk creating discord that will shatter the barriers entirely. Too slow, and the deep dweller will have time to interfere with our working." The ceremony began with Aput striking the first bell, its tones so pure and clear that it seemed to resonate in their bones rather than their ears. The sound carried the essence of new life, of hope emerging from darkness, of the first breath drawn by every living thing. As the note faded, the sacred fire in the meteoric bowl flared brighter, its flames reaching toward the chamber's ceiling like prayers made visible. The second bell followed, struck by a guardian whose age was impossible to determine. This tone spoke of growth, of potential becoming reality, of seeds breaking through soil towards sunlight. The blessed water began to glow with inner light, its impossible flow creating patterns that resembled the neural networks of some vast intelligence. Each subsequent bell added its voice to a harmony that seemed to reshape the very air around them. The crystal bells sang of experiences that spanned the entire cycle of existence, their combined frequencies creating something larger than the sum of their individual parts. The chamber filled with light that had no source in the physical world, illumination that revealed truths normally hidden from human perception. When Nayeli struck the fourth bell, the one representing wisdom, the deep dweller's presence made itself known. The temperature in the chamber plummeted beyond anything they had experienced, and frost began forming on the walls in patterns that suggested intelligence behind their creation. Something vast and alien had noticed their working and was turning its attention toward them. The remaining guardians continued the sequence despite the growing supernatural pressure. The fifth bell spoke of sacrifice willingly given, its tone carrying echoes of every life offered to protect others. The sixth bell sang of transformation, of death that leads to rebirth, of endings that make new beginnings possible as they prepared to strike the final bell, the one that would complete the harmony and strengthen the barriers. The deep dweller's influence reached a crescendo. The chamber's ice walls began to crack, and through the fissures came whispers in languages that predated human speech. The entity was trying to break through directly, using the ceremony's power to fuel its own escape attempt. As the final bell's tone faded and the chamber's supernatural assault subsided, the ancient guardian led them to a tall pillar they hadn't noticed before, a totem carved from a single piece of wood, so old it had turned to stone, while maintaining every detail of its original form. The knowledge totem rose from floor to ceiling, its surface covered in carved figures and symbols that told the complete history of the Arctic people's struggles against forces that defied human understanding. Now that the barriers have been strengthened, you must understand what you truly face, the guardian said, placing both hands against the totem's ancient surface. The deep dweller is not merely a creature from another realm. It is a force of entropy itself, a living embodiment of the universe's tendency toward chaos and decay. As he spoke, the carved figures on the totem began to move, animating scenes that revealed truths hidden for millennia. The images showed the first encounters between human settlements and the entity's influence, depicting how entire communities had been transformed by exposure to its alien consciousness. The changes weren't immediate or obvious. They began as subtle alterations in behavior, small departures from established customs, minor disagreements that gradually escalated into violence. The totem revealed that the deep dweller fed on discord and despair, growing stronger whenever communities fractured along lines of fear and mistrust. Its influence worked like a disease, spreading from person to person through emotional contagion rather than physical contact. Those affected became carriers who unknowingly spread the corruption to others, creating expanding circles of chaos that eventually consumed entire civilizations. But there is something different about the current awakening, the guardian continued, his expression growing increasingly grave. Previous cycles occurred in ages when human populations were small and scattered. Now your people have created technologies that amplify the deep dweller's reach beyond anything our ancestors faced. The totem's moving images showed modern scenes that chilled both hunters to their cores. Radio waves carrying the entity's influence across vast distances, electronic networks spreading its consciousness through communication systems designed to connect rather than corrupt. Machines that had been subtly reprogrammed to serve purposes their creators never intended. The mining operations, the research stations, the permanent settlements built on previously untouched ground, the Guardian explained. Each represents another crack in the prison, another pathway for the deep dweller's influence to seep into your reality. Your people have unknowingly been preparing for its arrival for decades. Aput studied the totem's revelations with growing horror. He recognized some of the modern locations shown in the animated carvings, research facilities he had seen during supply runs, mining operations that had been established in regions his grandfather had always avoided, communications towers that had sprouted across the landscape like metallic weeds. "How long do we have?" Nayeli asked, though his voice suggested he feared the answer. "The barriers we strengthen tonight will slow the process, but they cannot stop it entirely," the Guardian replied. "The Deep Dweller has already established too many footholds in your modern world. Complete awakening is now inevitable. The only question is whether your people will be prepared when it occurs." The knowledge totem revealed the entity's ultimate goal. It sought not merely to escape its prison, but to transform the Arctic regions into an extension of its own alien realm. The changes would begin subtly: unusual weather patterns, behavioral modifications in wildlife, technological failures that defied logical explanation. But as its influence grew stronger, the transformations would become impossible to ignore. The carved images showed a world where the aurora burned with impossible colors that drove viewers insane, where the ice itself became a living medium for the entity's consciousness, transforming familiar landscapes into nightmare geometries that human minds couldn't process, where the cold became something that killed not just the body but the soul itself, leaving behind empty vessels that served the Deep Dweller's will. "Your ancestors prepared for this moment," the Guardian continued, indicating sections of the totem that detailed ancient contingency plans. Knowledge was scattered across multiple cultures to ensure survival even if some communities fell to the corruption. Weapons were created and hidden in places where they could be retrieved when needed. Alliances were established between peoples who might otherwise have remained strangers. The Brus totem revealed locations where these ancient preparations had been cached: weapons forged from materials that could harm entities from other dimensions, protective wards that could shield communities from the Deep Dweller's influence, and most importantly, detailed instructions for rituals that could permanently banish the entity if performed correctly. But the requirements for these ultimate rituals demanded cooperation on a scale that had never been achieved. Representatives from every Arctic culture would need to work together, sharing resources and knowledge that had been carefully guarded for centuries. The timing would be crucial, requiring coordination across vast distances during a period when normal communication systems might be compromised by the entity's influence. "This is why you were guided to find us," the Guardian said, meeting their eyes with an intensity that conveyed the weight of destiny. "You must serve as messengers, carrying this knowledge to communities that have forgotten the old agreements. You must convince them to set aside modern skepticism and trust in wisdom their ancestors preserved." For exactly this moment, the totem's final revelation showed them what success would look like and what failure would cost. Victory would require sacrifices that would transform the Arctic regions forever, but would preserve them as places where human life could continue. Defeat would mean watching their homeland become an alien realm, where nothing familiar could survive. The ancient Guardian reached beneath his robes and withdrew, an amulet unlike any of the artifacts they had encountered. The detection amulet was carved from what appeared to be compressed ice, but ice that had been subjected to pressures and temperatures that shouldn't exist in nature. Within its crystalline structure, veins of dark material pulsed with rhythms that seemed to echo the heartbeat of something vast and alien. "This will warn you when the Deep Dweller's influence grows strong," the Guardian explained, fastening the cord around Aput's neck. "But be warned, as its power increases, the amulet's warnings will become more intense. What begins as gentle warmth will eventually become pain that threatens to overwhelm your senses." Even as he spoke, the amulet began to pulse with increasing frequency. What had started as a barely perceptible vibration was now a steady throbbing that seemed to resonate in Aput's bones. The Deep Dweller was stirring in response to their ritual, and its awakening was accelerating beyond the Guardian's expectations. A sound began to emanate from the depths beneath them, not the low vibrations they had heard before, but something that resembled breathing on a scale that defied comprehension. Each exhalation seemed to shake the tunnel complex's foundations, and with each breath, the temperature continued to drop beyond what should have been survivable. "It knows we're here," Nayeli observed, his words creating clouds of vapor that froze instantly in the frigid air. "The strengthening ritual, it felt our presence," the Guardian nodded grimly. "The barriers we reinforced will contain it for now, but the process has attracted its attention in ways we didn't anticipate. It's actively probing for weaknesses, testing every seal and ward that holds it in place. Through the complex's ice walls, they could see lights moving in patterns that hurt to observe directly. The deep dweller was using some form of bioluminescence to communicate, creating displays that carried meanings beyond human comprehension. The lights pulsed in mathematical progressions that seemed to represent concepts rather than simple messages, as if the entity was performing calculations that involved the fundamental structure of reality itself. The detection amulet's pulsing intensified suddenly, causing Aput to gasp as pain shot through his chest. Something had changed in the depths below. The deep dweller had discovered something that accelerated its escape attempts. The Guardian's expression grew even more troubled as he studied the amulet's increasingly frantic warnings. "The modern installations," he said, understanding dawning in his ancient eyes. "It's using them as amplification points. Every electronic device, every radio transmission, every electrical current is being converted into tools for its liberation. Above them, beyond the tunnel complex, the aurora had begun to burn with colors that belonged to no earthly spectrum. The lights moved in spirals that seemed to focus toward a point directly overhead, as if the deep dweller was using the planet's magnetic field to coordinate its escape efforts. Animals across the Arctic regions would be fleeing now, following instincts older than human civilization that warned them of approaching catastrophe. The Guardian led them through passages that had begun to show signs of structural stress. Ice walls that had remained stable for centuries now bore spiderweb patterns of cracks, and from some of these fissures came whispers in languages that predated human speech. The deep dweller's influence was seeping through the barriers like poison through a wound. "How long?" Aput managed to ask, though speaking required effort as the amulet's warnings grew stronger. "Hours, perhaps less," the Guardian replied. "The entity has learned to use your people's technology against the very barriers designed to contain it. What should have taken months or years is now happening in real time." They reached a chamber where several other Guardians had gathered, their faces showing the strain of maintaining consciousness while supernatural forces pressed against their minds. Each wore their own detection amulet, and the combined pulsing of multiple warnings created a rhythm that resembled a countdown to some unimaginable deadline. "The communities must be warned immediately," one of the other Guardians said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed the deep dweller's previous awakenings. "But traditional means of communication will be compromised. It's already learned to corrupt electronic signals." The detection amulet around Aput's neck had grown so hot it was beginning to burn his skin, yet he couldn't bring himself to remove it. The pain served as a constant reminder of how quickly their situation was deteriorating, how little time remained before the entity achieved the freedom it had sought for millennia. Seismic tremors began to shake the tunnel complex with increasing frequency, each one stronger than the last. The deep dweller was testing the geological foundations of its prison, probing for weaknesses that could be exploited. With each tremor, more cracks appeared in the ice walls, and the whispers from beyond grew louder and more insistent. "We need to reach the surface," the Guardian said, his calm facade finally showing signs of strain. "The final phase requires preparations that can only be made in the world above. And we must warn your people before the corruption spreads too far to contain." The detection amulet's warnings had become a constant scream of pain that threatened to overwhelm Aput's consciousness. Yet even through the agony, he could sense that this was only the beginning. Breaking through the snow that had accumulated over the tunnel entrance felt like emerging from one nightmare into another. The world above had transformed during their time below. The aurora burned across the sky in impossible patterns that seemed to form geometric shapes before dissolving into chaos. And the air itself carried a charge that made their skin tingle with unnatural energy. The ancient guardian pressed a rolled banner into Aput's hands, its fabric woven from materials that shouldn't exist in nature. The unity banner felt warm despite the frigid air, and when unrolled, it revealed symbols that seemed to shift and change as he watched. Each marking represented a different Arctic community, and somehow the banner knew which people still maintained the old knowledge and which had forgotten their ancestral responsibilities. "This we'll call them," the Guardian explained, his breath forming crystals that fell like tiny stars. "But the summons will also alert the deep dweller to our gathering. We risk everything on the hope that unity will prove stronger than the force we face." Aput held the banner aloft, and immediately the symbols began to glow with light that pierced the supernatural darkness overhead. The illumination spread outward from their position, like ripples in a pond, carrying messages that transcended ordinary communication. Across the Arctic regions, shamans and elders would feel the call in their bones, understanding without words that the time of greatest trial had arrived. Within hours, figures began appearing on the horizon, first as distant specks against the snow, then as dog sleds and snowmobiles, carrying representatives from communities scattered across thousands of miles. They came from Greenland and Alaska, from Siberia and northern Canada, following compulsions that their rational minds couldn't explain, but their ancestral memories recognized as authentic. The first to arrive was UKI, an elderly Sami herder whose reindeer had refused to graze in their traditional territories for weeks. His weathered face showed the strain of someone who had witnessed phenomena that challenged everything he thought he understood about the natural world. "The animals know," he said without preamble, studying the unity banner with eyes that had seen too much. "They flee from places their ancestors used for countless generations. Something rises that should not be allowed to exist in our world." Siku arrived next, a young Inupiat woman whose grandfather had taught her the old songs despite her community's adoption of modern ways. She brought with her artifacts that had been hidden in her family's possession for generations, carved bone implements and leather pouches containing substances that glowed with their own light. "The dreams," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everyone in our village shares the same nightmares now. Dark waters rising through ice, voices speaking in languages that hurt to hear, shapes moving beneath the earth that are too large to be alive." More representatives continued to arrive throughout the night. Chukchi shamans from the Russian Far East, Aleut fishermen whose nets had been bringing up things that belonged in no earthly ocean. Thule descendants who carried weapons their ancestors had forged specifically for battles against supernatural threats. Each newcomer brought reports that painted a picture of accelerating catastrophe, electronic equipment failing across the Arctic regions, not from cold or mechanical problems, but because the circuits themselves were being rewritten by forces that understood technology better than its creators. Communication satellites falling silent one by one as something learned to corrupt signals from space itself. The ancient guardian addressed the growing assembly, his voice carrying across the wind, despite speaking barely above a conversational tone. "The deep dweller stirs in its ancient prison, using tools our ancestors could never have imagined. But the knowledge needed to contain it has been preserved, scattered among your peoples like seeds waiting for the proper season." He gestured toward the unity banner, which now displayed a map showing the locations of hidden caches across the Arctic regions. Each marked site contained weapons, protective wards, or ritual implements that had been prepared centuries ago for exactly this confrontation. But accessing these resources would require cooperation between communities that had maintained centuries-old rivalries and suspicions. The Sami possess the binding songs that can hold otherworldly entities, the Guardian continued, The Inuit control access to stones that can anchor reality when dimensions begin to blur. The Chukchi guard flames that burn in ways the deep dweller cannot extinguish. Alone, each group has fragments of what is needed. Together, you might possess the complete solution. Skepticism warred with ancestral knowledge on many faces. Representatives from communities that had embraced modern technology struggled to accept explanations that belonged to worldviews they had abandoned. But the evidence continued mounting around them, the unnatural aurora overhead, the detection amulets increasingly frantic warnings, and the reports of impossible phenomena that multiple independent witnesses had observed. Tapisa, an elder from Nunavut, whose authority commanded respect from all present, stepped forward to examine the unity banner more closely. The symbols responded to her touch, revealing sections that detailed ancient agreements between her ancestors and other Arctic peoples. "These accords," she said, tracing patterns that seemed to move beneath her fingers. "My grandmother spoke of them in stories I thought were legends. Promises made between our peoples to stand together when the earth itself was threatened." The banner revealed that their ancestors had anticipated this moment, understanding that future generations might forget the old knowledge in favor of modern conveniences. Emergency protocols had been established, hidden in stories and songs and seemingly decorative patterns on traditional crafts, waiting for someone with the wisdom to recognize them when circumstances demanded their activation. The ancient guardian produced a leather pouch containing 7 stones that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Each blessing stone was carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly, and when he poured them onto a seal skin spread across the snow, they arranged themselves in patterns that suggested meanings beyond human comprehension. The stones hummed with frequencies that seemed to resonate in their bones, creating harmonics that made the very air feel charged with potential. "These stones have waited centuries for this moment," the guardian explained, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated ages. "They can imbue ordinary weapons with the power to harm entities that exist outside normal reality. But the blessing ritual requires perfect cooperation between all represented peoples, and any discord in the circle will render the stones powerless." The assembled representatives formed a circle around the blessing stones, each person carrying weapons that had been passed down through their families for generations. Harpoons carved from walrus ivory, knives forged from meteoric iron, bows strung with sinew from animals that had lived in harmony with the spiritual world. These were not mere hunting tools, but sacred implements that had been consecrated through generations of use in protecting their communities. UKI, the Sami herder, placed his ancestral staff in the circle's center. The carved reindeer antler bore symbols that seemed to move in the blessing stone's influence, and the metal points embedded in its tip began to glow with the same inner light that illuminated the guardian's artifacts. "My grandfather told me this staff could pierce the veils between worlds," UKI said, his voice heavy with responsibility he had never expected to bear. "I thought the stories were metaphor. Now I understand they were instruction manuals." Siku added her family's hunting knife, its blade forged from iron that had fallen from the sky during her great-grandmother's youth. The meteoric metal had always been considered sacred, but now it pulsed with energies that transformed it into something beyond earthly materials. One by one, each representative placed their weapons within the circle, creating a collection of implements that represented thousands of years of accumulated wisdom about fighting supernatural threats. The blessing stones began to resonate more strongly, their humming harmonizing with natural frequencies that existed in the weapons themselves. The ancient guardian began a chant in languages that predated any written history, words that seemed to reshape reality around them. As his voice rose and fell in patterns that followed the stone's resonance, the weapons began to change. not in their physical appearance, but in the fundamental nature of what they were becoming. The ritual required each person to contribute not just their weapon, but a memory of their ancestors' courage. Tepisa spoke of her grandmother's decision to remain behind when their community evacuated during a supernatural winter that had lasted 3 years. Utu, a young Aleut fisherman, shared the story of his great-uncle who had sailed into waters where reality itself became unstable to rescue trapped hunters. As each memory was offered, the blessing stones absorbed the experiences and used them to transform the weapons further. The implements were becoming more than tools. They were vessels for ancestral courage, containers for the accumulated will of every person who had ever stood against forces that threatened the natural order. But the ritual demanded more than individual contributions. The representatives had to synchronize their breathing, their heartbeats, their very thoughts into a unified pattern that the blessing stones could use to channel power effectively. This proved challenging for people from communities that had maintained centuries of independence and subtle rivalries. Disagreements emerged almost immediately. The Sami representatives favored defensive strategies that emphasized protection over confrontation. The Inuit hunters advocated for direct assault, using weapons they knew how to wield effectively. The Siberian shamans insisted that spiritual preparations were more important than physical armaments. This is why the deep dweller grows stronger, the Guardian observed, watching the discord with growing concern. It feeds on division, on the inability of good people to work together toward common goals. Every moment of disagreement gives it more power to influence your thoughts. The detection amulet around Aput's neck had begun pulsing so rapidly it felt like constant vibration, and the pain was becoming difficult to ignore. The deep dweller was responding to their preparations, actively working to sow discord among the gathered peoples. Thoughts that weren't entirely their own began creeping into their minds, suspicions about other communities' motives, resentments about ancient grievances, fears that cooperation would mean sacrificing cultural identity. CQ recognized what was happening first. "It's in our thoughts," she said, her voice cutting through the growing arguments. "This isn't us talking. This is that thing down there turning us against each other." The realization helped, but fighting the influence required constant vigilance. Every decision became a battle between their authentic desires and subtle manipulations that felt almost indistinguishable from their own thoughts. The blessing stones could protect their weapons from supernatural corruption, but they couldn't shield human minds from an entity that had spent millennia learning to exploit the weaknesses in consciousness itself. Working together despite the mental interference, they completed the blessing ritual as seismic tremors began shaking the ground beneath their feet. The deep dweller was testing its prison with increasing frequency, and each tremor was stronger than the last. The earth split open with a sound like thunder, but thunder that went on for minutes rather than seconds. From the widening chasm came light that belonged to no earthly spectrum, and with it rose something that challenged every assumption about what could exist in their reality. The deep dweller didn't emerge so much as unfold into their dimension, its form shifting between states that human vision couldn't properly process. Part of it resembled an enormous cephalopod, but one that existed in more dimensions than their minds could perceive. Tentacles that seemed to extend through space and time writhed against barriers that were rapidly weakening, each movement creating ripples in reality that made the very air shimmer with wrongness. Where its appendages touched the ice, the frozen surface didn't melt. It transformed into something that wasn't quite liquid and wasn't quite solid, but existed in a state that shouldn't be possible. The ancient guardian reached into robes that seemed deeper than they should be and withdrew a chain that appeared to be forged from crystallized starlight. The binding chain was translucent, yet stronger than any earthly metal, and as he lifted it, the links chimed with harmonics that seemed to come from the spaces between atoms themselves. This was forged in the first days. When the barriers between worlds were new, the Guardian said, his voice somehow carrying over the supernatural storm that had erupted around the emerging entity. It can hold beings that exist outside normal reality, but only if wielded by those who understand the true nature of sacrifice. The deep dweller's influence expanded like a plague, affecting everything it touched in ways that defied natural law. The aurora overhead had become a swirling vortex of impossible colors that hurt to observe directly, and the very air began to thicken into something that was becoming difficult to breathe. Worse, the entity's presence was affecting their thoughts, filling their minds with whispers in languages that predated human speech. Aput felt the binding chain's weight as the Guardian placed it in his hands. The artifact was simultaneously lighter than air and heavier than stone, existing in a state of paradox that seemed to be its defining characteristic. He could sense the accumulated will of countless guardians who had prepared for this moment. Their sacrifices woven into the chain's crystalline structure, the deep dweller's attention focused on their small group with an intensity that was almost unbearable. Its consciousness was vast beyond human comprehension, yet it noticed them with the particular attention that a human might give to an interesting insect. When it spoke, the words bypassed their ears entirely and appeared directly in their minds. Mortals who dream of binding eternity. Your ancestors made this same attempt and failed. Your descendants will make it again when I have finished with your reality. The cycle continues because you lack the will to break it permanently. The entity's words carried truth that was terrifying to contemplate. This wasn't the first time the deep dweller had escaped its prison, and previous attempts to contain it had only succeeded in delaying rather than solving the fundamental problem. Each cycle, it learned more about human nature, developed better strategies for corruption and manipulation, grew stronger from the fear and discord it generated. Nayeli positioned himself at the binding chain's other end, understanding without words that this would require perfect coordination between them. The chain could restrain the entity, but only if deployed with timing that allowed no margin for error. One mistake would give the deep dweller the opportunity to corrupt the binding itself, turning their most powerful weapon into another tool for its liberation. The assembled Arctic peoples formed defensive positions around them, their blessed weapons glowing with inner light that seemed pitiful against the magnitude of what they faced. Yet each person stood firm despite the supernatural terror that pressed against their minds, drawing strength from ancestral memories of similar courage displayed in earlier ages. The deep dweller began to pull itself fully into their reality, and with each segment that emerged, the fundamental nature of the Arctic regions started to change. Ice became something that burned without heat. Snow fell upward toward a sky that had become liquid. The magnetic field itself began to wobble as the entity's presence interfered with natural forces that had remained stable for millions of years. Now, the Guardian commanded, and Aput threw the binding chain's first loop toward what might have been the entity's central mass. The chain passed through several tentacles as if they were insubstantial, but when it encountered the deep dweller's core essence, it solidified into something that could restrain beings that existed beyond normal physics. The entity's roar of rage and surprise shook the ground for miles in every direction, and several of the gathered humans fell to their knees as the sound bypassed their ears and attacked their nervous systems directly. But the first binding was only the beginning. The chain had to be wrapped around the entity in patterns that followed mathematical principles older than geometry, creating a containment that worked in dimensions their minds couldn't perceive. Each loop required perfect placement, and the deep dweller fought against every attempt with intelligence that had been accumulating knowledge for geological ages. The binding chain held, but barely. Each loop around the deep dweller's writhing form glowed with strain that threatened to shatter the crystalline links, and the entity's struggles sent shockwaves through dimensions that human senses couldn't perceive. Yet even restrained, It continued to corrupt the reality around them, transforming familiar Arctic landscape into something that belonged to alien geometries. The ancient guardian produced the final artifact, a crystal unlike any they had seen, carved into facets that seemed to extend beyond three-dimensional space. The sealing stone pulsed with contained energy that made their teeth ache, and when he held it aloft, the very air around it began to crystallize into structures that followed mathematical laws from other universes. "This can imprison the deep dweller permanently," the guardian explained, his voice strained by the effort of maintaining consciousness while supernatural forces pressed against his mind. "But the sealing requires a guardian to remain with the prison, someone whose life force will power the containment for as long as consciousness endures." The implications struck them all simultaneously. Permanent imprisonment meant permanent sacrifice. Someone would have to stay with the deep dweller in whatever dimensional space the sealing stone created, maintaining the barriers through sheer force of will until death finally released them from the obligation. Nayeli stepped forward without hesitation. "I'll do it." "No," Aput said immediately, understanding what his friend intended. "You have a wife, children who need their father. I'm older. I've lived my full life." "Neither of you understands," the guardian interrupted, his ancient eyes reflecting knowledge that carried terrible weight. "The guardian must be someone the deep dweller cannot corrupt, someone whose connection to life and hope is too strong to be twisted into despair. Age and experience matter less than the purity of purpose that drives the decision." The deep dweller sensed their discussion and redoubled its efforts to break free from the binding chain. Several links began to show hairline cracks, and the entity's influence expanded to encompass their thoughts more directly. Whispers filled their minds, promises of power, threats of consequences, attempts to convince them that resistance was futile and cooperation would be rewarded. But the sealing stone in the guardian's hands offered a different kind of whisper. It spoke of purpose that transcended individual survival, of sacrifices that created meaning from apparent loss, of love that grew stronger when tested by impossible circumstances. The crystal had been created by people who understood that some battles could only be won by those willing to pay the ultimate price. CQ moved closer to the group, her young face showing resolve that reminded them all why their ancestors had chosen to preserve this knowledge through countless generations. "The dreams showed me this moment," she said quietly. "I've been seeing it every night for months. I know what has to be done." The binding chain began to sing, literally sing, as stress fractures appeared in several links. The deep dwellers' struggles were reaching a crescendo, and they had perhaps minutes before the restraints failed completely. Once free, the entity would be impossible to contain again, having learned from this experience how to counter their methods. "The sealing must happen now," the guardian said, raising the crystal above his head. "But whoever accepts this responsibility needs to understand that the prison exists outside normal time. You will be conscious and aware for what feels like eternity, standing guard against something that never stops trying to escape." Nayeli reached for the sealing stone, but Aput caught his wrist. "Brother, your children need to grow up in a world where their father's sacrifice meant something. Let me give them that world." "Both of you stop," Siku said with authority that surprised them all. "This isn't about who deserves to sacrifice themselves. It's about who can maintain hope longest against something that feeds on despair. It's about who has the strongest connection to life, to love, to everything the deep dweller wants to destroy." She was right, and they all knew it. The youngest among them carried the purest connection to the future they were fighting to preserve. Her love for the world was uncomplicated by decades of disappointment and loss, her hope untainted by the cynicism that accumulated with age. The guardian placed the sealing stone in Siku's hands, and immediately the crystal began to resonate with frequencies that seemed to emanate from her very soul. The artifact recognized something in her that it had been created to work with, an unshakable belief that life was worth preserving regardless of the cost. "I understand," she said simply, and the crystal flared with light that began to envelope both her and the struggling deep dweller. The sealing process created a sphere of crystallized space-time that existed partially in their reality and partially in dimensions where the entity could be contained indefinitely. Sikyu stepped into the sphere willingly, the sealing stone transforming into a prison that would hold both guardian and prisoner until the end of time itself. Her last words carried across the dimensional barriers as the sphere sealed completely. "Tell my grandmother I remembered the old songs." The deep dweller's roars of rage and frustration faded as the prison solidified, taking both entities into a space where they would struggle eternally, her hope against its despair, her love against its hunger for destruction. 3 months after the sealing, Aput stood at the edge of what had once been a battlefield between dimensions, but was now a circle of perfectly normal Arctic ice. The only sign of what had occurred here was a small mound at the center, beneath which lay a crystal that preserved the complete story of their struggle for future generations who might face similar threats. The legacy crystal had been the ancient guardian's final gift before he returned to the long sleep, understanding that his purpose had been fulfilled, but that others would need to carry the knowledge forward. The gem pulsed with gentle light that was visible only to those who had participated in the sealing or who possessed the particular sensitivity that marked potential guardians. The aftermath had been as challenging as the battle itself. Governments had sent investigators to examine the seismic anomalies and electromagnetic disturbances that had been recorded across the Arctic regions. Scientists arrived with instruments designed to measure phenomena that their theories couldn't explain. Military personnel established temporary bases to monitor what they classified as unusual geological activity, but the investigators found nothing that their instruments could quantify. The deep dweller's influence had vanished so completely that even the most sensitive equipment detected only normal background radiation and typical magnetic field variations. To the outside world, the events had been reduced to unexplained natural phenomena that would eventually be filed away and forgotten. The Arctic peoples knew better. Representatives from dozens of communities had witnessed transformations that would reshape their understanding of their role in the world. Ancient agreements that had been preserved in stories and songs suddenly carried the weight of actual responsibility. Sacred objects that had been treated as cultural artifacts revealed themselves as functional tools for monitoring supernatural threats. Nayeli approached across the snow, his face showing the changes that 3 months of processing impossible memories had created. He carried a notebook where he had been recording everything he could remember about the tunnel complex, the artifacts they had encountered, and the knowledge the Guardians had shared. The written record would supplement the legacy crystal, providing practical details that future generations might need. "The elders have made their decision," Nayeli said, stopping beside his old friend. "Every community will maintain watchers now, people trained to recognize the signs if something like this ever stirs again." The new Guardian network represented an unprecedented level of cooperation between Arctic peoples who had maintained independence for countless generations. Shamans shared knowledge that had been closely guarded secrets. Hunters taught tracking skills that could be applied to supernatural as well as natural prey. Craftspeople revealed techniques for creating tools that could affect entities from other dimensions. Aput nodded, understanding that this responsibility would define the rest of their lives. The detection amulet he still wore had grown quiet since Sikyu's sacrifice, but it continued to pulse occasionally, reminding him that other threats existed in the spaces between worlds. The deep dweller had been the most immediate danger, but not the only one. "The young ones adapt quickly," Nayeli continued, gesturing toward a group of teenagers who were learning to use the blessed weapons under supervision from their elders. "They don't struggle with believing the impossible the way our generation did." The observation carried both hope and concern. Children who grew up understanding that reality contained layers beyond normal perception would be better prepared to serve as guardians, but they would also carry burdens that previous generations had been spared. The knowledge that supernatural threats existed would shape their worldview in ways that might isolate them from peers who hadn't shared these experiences. The legacy crystal pulsed brighter as Aput knelt beside it, responding to his presence with recognition that suggested Siku's consciousness somehow remained connected to the artifact. He had developed the habit of visiting this spot regularly, partly to maintain his connection to the knowledge they had gained, but mostly because it felt like honoring her sacrifice. "She's still fighting," he said quietly, placing his palm against the warm stone. "I can feel her determination, her refusal to let despair take hold. Even in that prison, she continues to hope." Nayeli joined him on the ice, adding his hand to Aput's above the crystal. For a moment, they could both sense her presence, not as clear communication, but as an impression of unshakable resolve that continued to hold the line against forces that would never stop trying to escape. The aurora began to dance overhead, but these were natural lights following familiar patterns that spoke of magnetic fields functioning normally and dimensional barriers holding firm. The colors painted the ice in shades of green and blue that belonged entirely to their reality, beautiful precisely because they contained no hint of the alien hues that had threatened to replace them. Other guardians would come to this place in years ahead, adding their own hands to the crystal and drawing strength from Siku's eternal vigil. The legacy crystal would preserve not just the factual record of their struggle, but the emotional truth of what had been risked and what had been saved. Future generations of Arctic peoples would grow up knowing that their homeland had been defended by heroes who understood that some victories required prices that could never be repaid. And when new threats eventually emerged from the spaces between worlds, they would find guardians ready to stand watch, armed with knowledge preserved in crystal and courage inherited from those who had faced the darkness and refused to surrender.